Okay, so hello, welcome to my presentation for Anthropology 242. My presentation is going to be on the media and violence. I look into the media's role into the justification of violence. So just before we get started here, I'm going to be basing my arguments on three main sources: Boyce and Chunu's Rebirth of a Nation, Brierson, Johnson, and Sherrington's Miner's Magic, and the Tough Guys documentary. Now, the thesis of Rebirth of a Nation is that many of the fears surrounding black equality present in D.W. Griffith's 1915 film Birth of a Nation still apply to today's society, while the Miner's Magic article analyzes the reasons behind the murder of albinos in Tanzania and the fetish surrounding the lucky nature of their body parts that is believed by many desperate miners. And additionally, Tough Guy's thesis is that the definition of what it takes to be a real man needs to be reassessed, and that we should applaud those who challenge the narrative that being a tough male means putting up a false front of disrespect and violence. In addition to these sources, I also will briefly be referencing the sources The Clean Snows of Petawawa, Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving, and the Two Worlds Colliding documentary. So I believe that the media does contribute to the justification of violence in the sense that it promotes ideals and false realities that we are tailored to accept as normal. In particular, violence against women and minorities is often promoted as normal and lesser, while violence against men and whites is a far more serious matter. In news, multimedia, and other forms of media are all based towards certain opinions regarding violence, and their voices are far more powerful than we give them credit for. Furthermore, people can find their own version of the truth if they look deep enough, for the media's views can be radically left/right. Therefore, while violence will never be fully eradicated because it is a natural part of who we are, the media has the same power to change cultures as it does to enforce them. So by acknowledging a cultural shift and directly blaming men for false violence, while acknowledging and addressing the ever-present issue of white privilege, the media can take a step towards a more fair and accurate analysis of violence, which will in turn lead to less violence overall. So before going straight into this presentation, I think it's important that we go back just a bit and make sure that the definition of violence is clear. So through the course of this presentation, when I refer to violence, I'm going to be referring to David Rich's definition, which is, of course, that violence is the act of physical, which is mental or emotional hurt, deemed to be legitimate by the performer and illegitimate by some of the witnesses. And it's important to note that violence is a part of the social existence and is a relationship between people. It cannot exist independent of ideas and reflects society/people's situations. So regardless of if there is media, if there isn't media, violence will always exist because it cannot exist independent of ideas. Now, when it comes to the media and violence relationship, I believe that behaviorism is central to understand. So behaviorism, of course, is violence that is learned and is learned more strongly when it is rewarded. It can be extinguished if it stops working. Also important to note is the rational choice theory, which states that people assess their circumstances and choose behavior based upon benefits they can gain. Violence is a choice, and perpetrators are not reckless, but they're simply in a bad situation and believe that the use of violence will help them out of it. So, especially when you think about the media and these two approaches, of course, behaviorism, we learn what we see. We see a lot of media everywhere we go. There's social media, there's movies, there's video games, it goes on and on. And especially the rational choice theory, the media basically dictates what is a good circumstance to use violence in. So lots of times you'll see maybe if you punch a bully, you're going to benefit from having them leave you alone. You're going to be cool. You're going to earn friends and respect, as well as maybe even the adoration of women. Lots of movies have that sort of plot line. So people will start to take advantage of that and say, okay, it's rational to be violent in that situation because the movies have told me so. The media has told me so. So this next slide talks about the media coverage of politics in the relation to violence. So modern day media validates everyone's opinion, as those who don't like what they hear can turn to extremist sites to have their opinions validated. As a consequence of this, it is extremely hard for the media to sway traditional stereotypes regarding women and race because there are so many options. Those who don't like what is real can turn to established conspiracy sites such as QAnon, or extremist news networks like Newsmax, and even more established news networks like Fox News sometimes promote or confirm the far-fetched beliefs that these conspiracy sites pitch to people. Now, the Miner's Magic article shows that people who are desperate will turn to crazy ideas if they seem to be in their best interests. So again, if you don't want to believe that COVID's real, you can go to some right-leaning websites, you can go to QAnon, and you can live in that little world, and then COVID's not real. Same goes for left, same goes for many other things. And in terms of Canadian media in particular, Donald Trump and American politics have invaded it pretty much. And even with Donald Trump gone and Joe Biden in, it's still the same American sentiment is constantly in Canadian media. So that means American views regarding war, guns, immigration, and racism all spill into our media. This allows us to learn violence because we are constantly around it. So this next slide talks about the portrayal of militarism in the media. Now, as I was saying, we hear a lot about war, guns, immigration, racism. All spills into our media in terms of movies, in terms of news. And the media often portrays peacekeeping, in particular, through the lens of the white man's burden, in the sense that it is seen as our duty to interfere in the affairs of less developed, non-white countries. This notion often results in the development of racism on the home front. The media's negative portrayal of other ethnicities as lesser enemies reinforces white supremacist stereotypes as well. So peacekeeping is portrayed as more of a foreign aid mission as opposed to military mission. It's sort of masked, in particular by the news. They won't talk about peacekeeping missions as if they're wars. They'll talk about them as if they are aid missions, foreign aid missions. And especially after 9/11, media broadcasts openly support wars, disguised as peacekeeping missions. So I'm talking things like Iraq and Afghanistan. They're peacekeeping missions in quotation marks because they were also pretty much wars, very violent. And we basically masked that. So personally, I remember that whenever a soldier would die in Afghanistan, you'd see on news stations and you'd see in the papers that the soldiers would be glorified as heroes who died fighting the enemy. And yet these networks would avoid criticizing the arguably unnecessary conflict. So moving to sort of some of the course readings, as the Clean Snows of Petawawa shows, peacekeepers often create unnecessary conflict in horrific ways. The media turns a blind eye to this and ignores the rape and other wrongdoings of peacekeepers, thus creating a false sense of reality. And as it states in that article, Canadian peacekeepers in Somalia did some pretty shameful things in the 1990s. However, while the media is aware of our wrongdoings, such as what I just stated, they choose to ignore them to conserve our identity as nice people. And this is blatantly evident in the fact that I'd never heard of the Somalia affair in the 1990s peacekeeping mission until this class. As it is never brought up in the media, we never shamefully go back to it. We actually try to maple wash it, and it's a form of whitewashing, basically Canadian style. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But basically, we act like these never happened to sort of conserve our identity as the nice country that does no harm. So, as with militarism, the media forces a false narrative onto us by defending males who commit crimes as opposed to facing the facts. I believe this is done in an attempt to preserve the traditional societal views of male dominance over women. So, of course, in terms of gender violence in the media, the documentary Tough Guys presents the disturbing facts that at least 77% of all armed robberies, assaults, domestic violence, and murders are committed by men, as well as 99% of all rapes. So these facts show that while violence is a male issue, it is framed as a human issue in the media, because instead of confronting the issue, many media forms use the excuse that it's not just men, it's women too, and enforce the false reality that women are just as violent as males. This is simply not correct, and the media needs to stop using the phrase violence against women and replace it with something like male violence against women in an effort to call males out and promote change. However, while the media can easily be used as a tool to challenge these views, the media is a double-edged sword, and despite its best intentions, people will continue to carve out what they believe to be the truth and renounce everything else. This goes right back to at the beginning where I was talking about political violence in the media. If people don't like what they hear, they'll just go somewhere where their views are welcomed. So if males don't like to hear that they are the violent ones, They can go places, Facebook chats, different websites, different media sources where their views are welcomed. So it's tough to get this change in here. So here's an example of this. Many people, usually women, will use social media as a means of revealing things such as sexual assault cases. So this is sensitive material, and they're usually praised and supported by others. However, backlash is often received in the form of something like, she was asking for it, etc., while others are hesitant to believe women's claims and instead believe that they just want attention. So again, gender violence in the media is something that many people still are hesitant to really accept, and that is why terms such as male violence against women need to be used in an effort to actually bring awareness to these issues and expose men instead of just bringing awareness to the violence that happens against women. Moving on to the role of hegemonic masculinity and the media. So the media, particularly the entertainment industry, reinforces the traditional beliefs of manhood and leaves little room for change in philosophy. Consequently, many movies, video games, etc. feature a macho male lead who is often accompanied by a female who seems lesser and dependent on the male. This sort of storyline sells, and as a result, the media brainwashes its consumers and reinforces gender roles, particularly the fact that males must be violent, competitive, and protective. So Tough Guy summarizes this up really well. It basically says that lots of movies portray violent males as good, as ideal. So this would be something like The Jock. The Jock always gets what he wants. He always gets the women, as opposed to timid males such as the nerd character. They're less of a man, less violent, competitive, and protective, and therefore lesser overall. And the media favors male violence over female violence. The media tells us women should be subordinate while males save them, in quotation marks. When a crime is committed, media does show women, but it is often men who commit the crime. And the media gives us a false sense of women being harmless and weak. And we're actually shocked when things such as, a female police officer shooting a black man has happened a few days back. Now, I think the quote, when you save someone, you imply that you are saving her from something, from the Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving article, page 788, really represents that just like we believe that we're liberating women who wear burqas from oppression, the media constantly showcases women being saved by men, thus making them seem inferior, just to close off that slide. So within the Miner's Magic article, the quote, they believe that they are not useful people, and if they die, they are not lost, from page 368, is used to describe the Tanzanian sentiment towards albinos. Now this quote highlights the sentiment felt against minorities across the globe, as the media normalizes the death of minorities while paying more attention to majorities in sympathetic manners. And I'll bring this back to maple washing. So basically, as I said, it refers to the tendency by Canadian governments, institutions, and the media to perpetuate the notion that Canada is morally superior to other countries, and thus concealing our negative actions of the past and present. So within the Worlds Colliding video, the Starlight Tours are maple washed. The video clearly shows that officers were identified and tried, and that the police force has insider info that was kept secret. Furthermore, the Wikipedia page was deleted numerous times in recent years by police associates, and no police officer has been charged for any of the 3 freezing deaths despite all of the evidence. So while this case should have been a wake-up call to the nation, police ultimately got off easily, and Indigenous people only had stereotypes regarding weakness and drug/alcohol abuse. Now, another example of racism in the media, the Rwandan Genocide of 1991 showcases the power of the media in the sense that the Rwandan media controlled the minds of the people via the radio and created a false narrative regarding Tutsis that led to nearly 1 million deaths. Internationally, there was little response until after the genocide because, as the top quote states, Rwanda and its people were not seen as useful to many countries. It's the same sort of sentiment. The minorities just don't matter. And I think the most fitting way to end this would be to end with a little analysis of the Black Lives Matter movement from the media's perspective. So the Black Lives Matter movement is a contemporary example of the power of the media as well as the biases that it carries. So the following quote from Rebirth of a Nation summarizes the current state of America. The United States continues to experience a rebirth of a nation grounded in the fears of black equality. Specifically, anti-black rhetoric portraying blacks as rapists, violent, and incapable of self-rule continues to be spread by white pundits or politicians who seem motivated to fight for every inch of black equality. That's taken from the page 126 of the article. With this in mind, the Black Lives Matter movement also does offer a glimpse at a possibly bright future for the media in terms of equality. So, as the Rebirth of a Nation article states, lynchings were justified by the media in the 1800s. Martin Luther King's peaceful protests were replaced with the concept of black power as violent and criminal in the 1960s. And the same thing is happening today. Just as with Martin Luther King's peaceful protests being portrayed as violent, the Black Lives Matter protests, the media puts a lot of the focus on the looters and the violence as opposed to the justice that is the underlying cause of the protests. People want justice for the death of George Floyd, rightfully so. Additionally, they would enforce the Black Beast narrative by continually pointing to George Floyd's criminal record, the fact that he may have been on drugs at the time of his death, and his heart condition, in an effort to paint him as a lesser other. However, the media is starting to cover racism more, but the one question is it a fad? So the Derek Chauvin trial was covered closely, and his arrest was praised by the media, and almost every organization made some sort of statement congratulating the fact that justice was served. Yet you have NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee to protest police brutality, still out of work, and there's not really anything being said about that. There's no reconciliation. So the question of the media truly embracing social justice against minority groups such as black people, it really remains to be seen. Are things changing for the better, or is it just a wave of social justice followed by another wave of the media creating more false narratives that promote old traditions and in turn promote more violence? So in conclusion to this presentation, the narratives portrayed by the media undoubtedly view minorities and females as lesser than whites and males, despite their best efforts to gloss over these facts. It is important to note that while media can be considered a credible source, it is not immune to biases. Usually the biases present in the media represent the stereotypes that are so ingrained in our own culture that we fail to recognize them at all. This presentation has highlighted that women and or minorities suffer mental or physical abuse far more than males and or majorities, and that the media often perpetuates narratives that further disadvantage women and or minorities. When analyzing this fact through Rich's definition of violence, it is clear that the media often justifies violence, particularly though not exclusively against women and or minorities. Therefore, to end this, media needs to restructure itself and embrace equality by shifting its bias away from what has traditionally been seen as acceptable. Now, the media's coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement is a step in the right direction regarding equality, but it remains to be seen whether the coverage is sincere or simply an attempt at appeasement. So with that, I have the references slide, and that is the end of my presentation.